Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. Hope you had a good lunch. It's a good physiological response after lunch is to let the eyelids droop, which is why we've put Denis on this afternoon, because he's just the person to make sure that your eyelids don't droop. Denis needs no introduction. He's the founding director of the Parrott Institute. He previously served as a biochemist and immunologist in Babraham, and is pretty well known for his book, Creation or Evolution, Do We Have to Choose? And that's the subject he's talking about this afternoon. Over to you, Denis.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Sorry I got a bit delayed there. That was my only confusion. I've just been setting up this laptop in the Healy Room in Westminster College because I saw a lovely crowd of people there who looked like ordinands, and they looked slightly puzzled. and I met the speaker who'd just spoken before, who I hadn't met before. He didn't look like Rodney Holder, and I was getting more puzzled. And I said, "Are you in the Faraday course?" And they said, "No." I said, "You just missed a talk about evolution." And they looked quite disappointed, actually. I thought I was going to recruit some up here. Anyway, here we are. Sorry about the delay. As you know, we like to make these courses as practical as possible, and I want to do that in the next 45 minutes or so. We want to give you material that's useful for your present parish ministry or your future parish ministry, and I would imagine that there are some parishes where the topic of creation and evolution is very unlikely to crop up, to be frank, in your daily parish ministry. But there are other parishes where it might crop up all the time. You might end up, on your first day in your new parish with a bunch of atheistic students who are telling you, or more likely actually, teenagers from local school age 15 or 16 telling you that Dawkins has disproved religion completely and science has, and so why bother talking about creation and that sort of thing. I actually received an email a few weeks ago from Turkey's only Anglican ordained minister who has a church in the Church of the Resurrection in Istanbul, which is growing quite well. He was telling me about it, and but he was saying that a number of Turkish folk, especially students in his congregation, have questions about creation evolution. Could I recommend materials in Turkish for the Anglican Church in Istanbul? I was happy to do that. We got some translated a few years ago, but he didn't seem to be aware of them. So you never know when this topic comes up. It pops up all over the place, and therefore I think, although we get a bit theoretical at times, I actually think this material you may find helpful in the future, and I hope so. Okay, now if I'm giving this talk to a church, and I can imagine I'm giving a talk to a church in some ways today, although I'm going to put a few slides in, probably I wouldn't bother about in the church context, but I always like to start with food in church context, and any context really. And so I put out these ice creams, and I asked people, well, there are all kinds of ways of choosing between things, and here's an example. I'm forced here to choose between a chocolate and a vanilla ice cream. But let's imagine now somebody tells me that I need to make the choice between appreciating the beauty of an ice cream and enjoying its taste. I might like to say that that's a slightly different kind of a choice. Here I might be able to appreciate both those aspects of the ice cream without having to be forced to make a choice. Whereas the top one here is a choice between two competing types of the very same kind of thing. And so that is a sort of theme that will be running in a way through this talk. Now, of course, we all know there are plenty of people around who will want to give the answer yes to our question this afternoon. You really do have to choose. Dawkins writes, I pay religions the compliment of regarding them as scientific theories when I see God as a competing explanation for facts about the universe in life. Well, that maps out very clearly. Here we have science, religion, as competing for the very same kind of territory. Darwin removed the main argument for God's existence. That sort of narrative, I think we're all familiar with that. It's quite curious, I think, in a way, that Dawkins' own rather limited philosophy of science is very similar to that of young earth creationists when you look at it carefully, but also think that their religious account is in some kind of rival with our current scientific understanding. And so, like Dawkins, they would also want to say the answer is yes, you have to choose between evolution and creation. You can't have both. And we suspect that the rhetoric of the new atheists has actually tended to increase the acceptance, adoption of young earth creationist views in this country. We don't know if that's the case. In fact, we have somebody, a researcher within the Faraday Institute, who is doing research on that topic right now, and we don't yet really have the results. But if you keep on telling Christians in the pew that evolution equals atheism, evolution equals atheism, go on telling people that, well, let's not be surprised then if that tends to drive some of our congregations into the arms of young earth creationism, because evolution is wrong and bad, it's all to do with atheism. So that narrative is quite powerful, especially in schools at the moment. We're just talking about that at lunchtime. Incredibly powerful narrative in secondary schools in this country. It's good to remember that if you look at the history of science, big science theories have nearly always been associated with some sort of ideology. And what happens is that you get a new scientific theory X, and then you get interest groups moving in, and they begin to invest their particular ideology in the prestige that that theory is gaining within the public domain. And pretty soon you have a sort of public understanding of scientific theory of X becomes equated with this ideological meaning Y. And I guess evolution is the classic example of that. If you go back and look at the history of the reception of evolution and the way it's been utilized since 1859, it's a very, very interesting history indeed. And as a matter of fact, it's been used, evolution has been used, Darwinian evolution has been used to support every possible kind of ism that you can imagine, including capitalism, communism, racism, militarism, eugenics, feminism, theism, atheism, and a lot of other isms besides. And when you look at that sort of list and you recognize that a number of these are mutually incompatible, you realize how flexible ideological transformations of big ideas can be, especially scientific ideas. And I think when you look into that, you realize perhaps some of the rhetoric and the controversy and the conflict that we've been seeing in the public domain over these past few decades in the USA in particular. Fortunately, not so much in this country, but occasionally it pops up. So when we've gone through that, I like to then present to folk a sort of general model of how we understand different types of knowledge, because I think that's could be helpful, and maybe this will pop up a number of times over the course of this course. And here's one model. It's not perfect, but I think it does a job for us. We can call it the complementarity model. We can imagine that the whole of reality, if you like, this book of life in which we find ourselves, is like a cube, and we can divide this cube down into many, many different layers, and each layer represents a different way of understanding or looking at the world. And so clearly we have a scientific level of understanding of the world where we're looking at the mechanisms and generalizations about the properties of matter and all that sort of stuff that scientists do. But we then have other levels of understanding. We obviously have an ethical level of understanding. What ought we to do with this new scientific data we just discovered? What ought I to do with my life, and so forth and so on. We have an aesthetic level of understanding. What do we count as beauty in the world, in the arts and theatre and so forth. Then we have our own personal biographies, our own personal understanding and experience of the world, unique to us as an individual. We have then many other layers. We can also put in then the religious understandings or questions about the world, and include philosophy there perhaps as well. Why is there a universe anyway? What breathes fire into the equations? A sort of question that Stephen Hawking likes to ask, does life have any purpose and meaning, and so forth. All those sort of big religious questions in life. And of course the point about drawing this on the back of the napkin as you're chatting with somebody, or perhaps in a church context or somewhere, and one of the reasons I like this model, it's very easy just to get a pencil out and jot it down. But obviously it makes the point that these levels of understanding are in no necessary contradiction or conflict with each other. They're complementary, most of the time they're complementary levels of understanding, and we can add many more. And we need them all to do justice to this highly complex reality that we call life. And if you think about it, this is how our universities are organised. And we have different departments, we have different faculties, and each faculty recognises that other forms of knowledge are constructed using rather different tools, if you like. Each discipline has its own particular way of justifying its beliefs. But in the university, most of the time, we don't go around batting each other on the head, as to say that our own discipline is the only one that gives real information. Now, of course, there are scientists who do that kind of thing. But honestly, I think they're a bit of a minority. And to be honest, I think people like Dawkins are a very, very small minority, in my experience, within the biological research community. And most of the time, there's a kind of mutual respect for different ways of understanding the world. And so, in contrast to Dawkins, then, who thinks there's competition going on, I think the first thing we need to lay out before people as we're trying to get science and faith ideas across, is this idea of complementarity, the idea that we need many narratives to really do the business of understanding the world around us. Now, of course, in any model, there's always a danger that we end up thinking these levels are isolated from each other, and so I like to put a few yellow arrows going down to talk about interdisciplinary interactions and that kind of thing, to remind ourselves that it's one reality, the created order is one reality, but we can look at it through theological spectacles and ask those are kind of questions. We can ask also questions through the spectacles of biology and so forth. So let's come back then to that question before us. Do we have to choose? And the way I would suggest going in this sort of topic is that we go with a sort of model of complementarity, and that's what we're going to do. I think the next thing I try and do, and especially in a church context, most people haven't done biology since GCSE or perhaps O-level, depending on the age group, and so I think it's always good to try and explain, what evolution means. And maybe there's some here who feel that, biology was a long time ago. And so I hope you'll forgive me if I spend a little bit of time on the biology here. And if this is all old stuff for you, you can snooze quietly. But I think we need to talk a bit about evolution before we go back to thinking about the theology. So, what is evolution? How do we biologists really understand what it's all about? I find, in a church context, again, I need to spend a bit of time in saying what it's not. Actually, I always start out by saying what evolution isn't, because people have got all kinds of ideas in their heads, about what evolution is about. So it's not some plot, by atheistic scientists to try and undermine belief in God. Clearly, some have made that into their life's mission. But, honestly, there aren't many of those, I don't think, around, to be frank. Certainly not at some sort of academic level, anyway. And it's certainly not a philosophy. I think we need to get that out. We're not talking here about a philosophy. Yes, there are lots of philosophies been attached to evolution, about the future of humanity and so forth and so on, but it's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about biological evolution, a biological scientific theory. What is it? Well, it's the best explanation that we have to explain the origins of all the biological diversity that we see on this planet today. In fact, the phrase that you won't find the word evolution at all, actually, in the Origin of Species, certainly not the first edition. You'll find the word evolved once or twice on the last page. So Darwin himself liked to talk about descent with modification, which is not a bad phrase, actually. And I think it was Darwin's brilliance, really, to bring history into biology. That's what he really did. And it was a brilliant move. And now it seems obvious to us. But, it always seems obvious after the event. And so he famously sketched out his tree and showed, quite clearly in the Origin of Species, gave lots of evidence that everything's joined up by history. Everything has a last common ancestor. Everything has a history. We're all made of the same stuff. That's not Darwin, of course. That's what we know now. We're all made of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, a few other elements. All these elements which are generated, synthesized in the dying moments of these supernovae and so on and so forth. So we're all made of stardust. We're all made of the same kind of stuff. And we all have the same genetic code. I'm talking about life here, life on this planet, with a few exceptions. We all have the same kind of biochemistry. We're all joined up. Okay, and that's the first thing I think to really get across. Now, of course, you notice we've talked so far about evolutionary theory, and this is something else which you often will find people quite confused on, this whole word theory. And I like collecting these usages. I'm afraid, sorry, apologies to any Americans here, but these tend to come up in the election time. This was 4 years ago. These are some of the hopefuls in the Republican race to become the Republican candidate for presidential, to get to the White House 4 years ago. And these are the people who didn't make it, actually. But anyway, you don't remember their names now. I'll show you in the next slide someone whose name you may have heard of. But Rick Perry asked about evolution. You only get asked about evolution in North America, nowhere else in the world, if you're a presidential hopeful. Evolution is just a theory that's out there. Notice the phrase, it's just a theory. You don't really believe a theory, do you? Evolution is a theory, and I don't accept it. Ron Paul. I love this one. I have to tell you this one. This is great. Okay. I mean, Donald Trump is a gift to journalists. And he says, he was asked about evolution, usual kind of question. I don't really believe in that stuff. Man coming from monkeys and apes, I don't think so. We are much more advanced than animals. Show me a monkey navigating the New York real estate scene. Show me a gorilla that is self-made multi-billionaire, because he is himself. I don't think you can. So you liberals can believe in evolution. You can trust the scientists. The same scientists, by the way, that push global warming even as New York gets colder and colder every winter. It's absurd. I love it. That's great. I do apologize to Americans here, but you know. My son-in-law is a journalist in Washington, and and I was checking. You know, we've just been living with him over Christmas time, and I mean, Trump is just a great gift, you know, to journalists. It's wonderful. Anyway, okay. So in science, then, the word theory. What does it really mean? Well, it really means it's something like a map, which is often likened to a map, a scientific theory, which draws together lots and lots of different bits of data and makes sense of them. Of course, we need different maps to do different kinds of job, and it's the same in science as well. It's a sort of overarching big idea which incorporates multiple components, joins them up together, makes sense. So when scientists talk about, you know, the theory of gravity or the theory of relativity, they're not actually expressing any doubt that things fall to the ground or that things are relative depending on the speed at which observers travel. They're using this word in this technical sense. And scientists, I tell you, are passionate defenders of their theories. They don't believe these are, they may change a bit and so on, and often they do, but they're defended passionately as making good sense of the data. So that's the way we scientists use the word theory. And the reason that biologists of every stripe use the evolutionary paradigm as their framework within which they operate, do their research, every biomedical lab, all the way around us, hundreds and hundreds of scientists here in Cambridge, all are operating within this evolutionary paradigm because it makes sense of what they do. Now, when Darwin was starting out, of course, there was some of these bits of data were around. Fossils, yes. Anatomy, yes. Genetics, not yet. Geology was there. Physiology was there, certainly, and so forth. Island species and so forth. But it's all kind of bits and bobs. You know, it was all separated out bits of data. And Darwin's brilliance was to join it all up then, to make a coherent story. And in science, you can only publish, really. You can only publish anything decent in a decent journal if you've got a coherent story, something that makes sense. And that's what Darwin did. Now, just to pick out, I'm not going to go into the whole evidence for evolution today, that's not my purpose, but just to give you an example of vestiges, which I rather like, you know, these are the things left over from the historical evolutionary past. And if you look at the baleen whale, for example, if you go to the Natural History Museum and you look for a baleen whale hanging up, I think you'll find there a separate wire hanging up this tiny little vestigial hind leg bone. It's there. It's still there. Good, excellent. So I'm not making it up. And that reflects the fact that you know these guys, these whales are mammals that evolved from the land. They used to walk on legs, and they still have a vestigial hind leg bone. It's not joined up to the main skeleton. It is a genuine vestigial organ. About 1 out of 500 whales, actually, this little hind leg bone actually comes out as a small leg. Whales, some whales have legs, very small, they're non-functional. But again, that kind of thing are all over the place. They're in our bodies as well. We have, by the way, in our genomes, the full genome set up to make tails is still there, you know, in our genomes. Interesting thought, which we won't go into now. But anyway, so you know, all kinds of wonderful vestiges are around in our bodies and the bodies of other organisms. And so the best explanation is that they have a history. And these are things left over and so on. So evolutionary theory is full of that kind of stuff. Now, what actually is going on in evolution? Well, it's really a two-step process. This is basic biology, but two-step process. In step one, the genome, that is the sum total of all the genetic information and the DNA of any organism, varies. And it varies for all kinds of different reasons. Sometimes mutations, sometimes genes are duplicated, sometimes there's flow of genetic information coming in from other populations, all kinds of chromosomal translocations, lots of different things go on, at least 12 different types of genetic variation. And so that generates then, in the next this generation, it generates little lion cubs in this case, which are slightly different. Not very much, but they might be slightly different. And one of them is a good runner and outruns the others, and adapts to its environment better than the others and so forth. So the second step then is what we call a filter, if you like, of natural selection. It's where all these genetic variants, which result in slightly different lion cubs, are kind of tested out in the workshop of life. And those which are most successful in terms of reproduction, we call reproductive success, then are more likely to pass on their particular sets of genetic variants to subsequent generations. So reproductive success is the key word here in the evolutionary process. Now, you may have heard the phrase survival of the fittest bandied around. This was invented by Herbert Spencer, who was a philosopher, and Darwin did begin to use that actually in later life. But survival of the fittest doesn't really express very well what evolution is about. Obviously, things have to survive in order to reproduce, but it's really the reproductive success which is the key here. And natural selection is a very, very stringent filter, right? So those are the two kind of critical steps in the process, and it's usually a pretty slow, incremental kind of process. I'm sorry about this. I apologize to any. Are there Americans? I'm sorry about this. All my examples seem to be from America. This is California. But it's to make the point, you can get these morphing programs off the web, and if you don't like your face, you can, change your face if you want to on your computer. And, you can do it gradually. And this gives, I think, a very nice illustration of the way that gradual evolutionary change takes place. And actually, if you look around this room, well, there we are. Okay, we've got slightly different genomes, we're all slightly different variants, so we all have slightly different faces and so forth. And evolutionary change is not always slow, as we'll see in a moment, but certainly animal, mammal evolution, that sort of thing, is on the whole pretty slow. And evolution takes place by populations. It's populations that evolve, not individuals. Individuals don't evolve, populations evolve. That's another key thing to remember in evolution. Just thinking now of species that we're very familiar with, all these dogs running around, they all look incredibly different. They all remember the same species. I bet if paleontologists had never heard of dogs and they dug them up in 200,000 years' time as fossils or something, maybe 500,000 years, they would tend to think these are actually different species. If you take a 2-pound Chihuahua and compare it with a 150-pound English Mastiff or Alsatian or something, they are pretty different. The point of showing you this is these are all members of the same species. They can all reproduce with each other in theory. In practice might be a bit hard. They all have 36 chromosome pairs, same species. But about 80%, we now know because the dog genome is sequenced, about 80% of the differences in the dog weight and height, the sort of variation that you see there, the morphology as we call it, about 80% is explained by variation in just 7 regions of the dog genome. Okay. So that's the point, that you don't actually need very much variation in the genome to see some pretty hefty, big differences in terms of morphology. What about species? What is a species? Well, it's just thought to be a group of populations which don't normally breed with other such groups. Very simple. As far as living species are concerned, obviously when it comes to fossils and so on, that's a little bit more tricky. Then you have to do it by morphology and so forth and so on. And speciation is thought to occur by 2 main mechanisms. One's called allopatric, or reproductive isolation, where 2 populations are separated from each other, 2 populations of the same species are separated, and then eventually they evolve differently. So let's say your population of snails there, species A, and you get separated down by a river that suddenly appears, and then you wait for 100,000 years or so, and then the river dries out, and then you may well find this population over here, although it can physically, geographically mingle once again with the other population, cannot interbreed because the accumulation of mutations in those 2 populations have been significantly different. Maybe adaptive. Maybe this is a bit up the hill and this down the hill and so on. And so reproductive isolation is thought to be the major cause of speciation, certainly in animals. And sympatric is the other one. Sympatric simply means where speciation occurs when a population, in the midst of a population, that can happen as well. It's a little bit rarer. The term macroevolution is often used to describe evolution of one species into another. If you look at creationist sort of views, generally speaking, often people will say, I agree with microevolution, small changes within the population, like the dogs we looked at, but macroevolution, in fact, no, I don't believe in that because that's too different in some way. So it's worth remembering that macroevolution is going on all the time as we speak. Point number one. Point number two, in terms of animal populations, it doesn't necessarily involve any mechanisms that are different from the kind of variation that we see in this room, except reproductive isolation. In plants, though, you do get some quite sudden speciation events, which are quite common, which happen through hybridization between two species of, this is a plant, Tragopogon, which was actually introduced into North America in the early part of the last century, and so its history has been mapped. And so what you get is a hybridization which is normally sterile, because these are two different species, but on occasion, rarely, for reasons not fully understood, you can get actually a doubling of the chromosome number, so you do get a progeny here which has got the chromosomes, in this case, from both the parental flowers, and so it's got actually 12 chromosome pairs as Tragopogon marus, and this particular flower has speciated many times actually in North America, and there's a whole literature about it, you know. And so, and if you look out in the garden, in the back garden, daffodils in the back garden, January, incredible. But you know, so many of these flowers out there have been either generated artificially through hybridization, or it's happened in the wild, like primroses actually happen in the wild. So speciation is pretty common. It's going on all the time, and I think that's an important point to get across. Some speciation is a bit faster in animals through what we call adaptive radiation. This is a lovely example actually from the Great Lakes in Africa. For example, there are more than 2,000 species of cichlids in the world. This is a type of freshwater fish, and many of them are found in the three Great Lakes of Africa. 500 of these species have evolved in Lake Victoria over the past 100,000 years, and each species has its own ecological niche. It lives at different heights, depths rather, in the lakes and so forth. These are distinct species. They don't interbreed with each other. They're reproductively isolated and so forth. And so that's relatively pretty rapid kind of speciation which goes on there. So speciation can be relatively rapid. Now, notice that in our own evolution, the idea is not that we descended from apes. Often people think that. It's not the case. The idea is that we shared a last common ancestor with our nearest and dearest cousin, the chimpanzee there. That's me down there. So we last shared a common ancestor about 6 million years ago. That's the current thinking based on genetic data. There were no chimpanzees 6 million years ago. We were certainly not there 6 million years ago. And since that time, we've gone our own separate ways. So we don't yet know how many intermediates there are between us and our last common ancestor, but somewhere between 5 and 10 is probably about the right kind of number. In fact, there's just an abundance of now fossil data from Africa about that, so we almost have too much data to interpret, because a number of the hominins, these intermediate species represented here by the red arrows, were living at the same time, and some of it's just difficult to know, you know, which is the branch that led to us, and so on. The Werner chimps, as I say, chimpanzees are relatively young, actually, in evolutionary terms. I think the oldest chimp fossil is about 600,000 years old, which for fossils is quite new. I want to show you just a few slides about human evolution, particularly since the emergence of modern humans in Africa about 200,000 years ago. So the oldest well-attested, well-dated fossil anatomically modern human dates from 196,000 years ago. Was found in Ethiopia. And most of our life, that is anatomically modern humans, we lived in Africa. It's nice there, and lots and lots of populations that, you know, were becoming reproductively isolated from each other actually, and so they're a bit genetically different. But around 60,000 years ago is when the first sort of significant migration took place. There was one actually 115,000 years ago, where there was an emigration out to what we now call Israel, and there's some anatomically modern humans discovered in caves there and so forth. But it looks as if they didn't go further, and that's a little bit uncertain at the moment for other data I won't talk about now. But certainly the main emigration out of Africa seemed to have taken place about 60,000 years ago. People then didn't like the weather in Europe, Ice Age, all that sort of thing. So they went over here, they got to Australia around about 50,000 years ago, pretty quick actually. Across the Bering Strait into North America about 18,000 years ago. and zooped down to South America, and then started backpedaling, backtracking as the weather got better, a bit better in Europe, 42,000 years ago, thereabouts. So that's the sort of rough current understanding of the emigration of, this is the out of Africa model, if you like, that we all come, we're all Africans under the skin, all that sort of thing. Now, one more point's worth knowing that based on genetic data, there have been a couple of bottlenecks. If you go back into the African human evolutionary history, you can never get more, you never get a bottleneck that's smaller than somewhere between 9,000 and 12,000 reproductively active individuals. Okay, well, it's never a couple. Let's get that, make sure we get that clear. No, we don't have one couple, we don't have 10 people, we have somewhere between around about 10,000 reproductively active individuals at some stage about 200,000 years ago. Remembering, of course, that this is a continual population change here. We're just talking about ongoing populations that are evolving as they move and as they adapt. Now, up until 2010, there was a pretty straightforward sort of replacement model. And the idea was, out of Africa, emigration, and as anatomically modern humans basically replaced the other hominins that were already in existence in these different parts of the world. That's now got more complicated, as things often do. So that's come about through the ability now to sequence quite ancient DNA. And it's quite clear there has been some interbreeding with Neanderthals. Neanderthals are our first cousin. We last shared a common ancestor with them somewhere around 600,000 years ago. And as what we now discover is that between 1.5 and 2.1% of the DNA of everyone in the world outside of Africa is Neanderthal DNA. Okay, it's Neanderthal versions of genes. You can quite clearly identify them. And so what the thought is that as the population came out of Africa about 60,000 years ago, there was some interbreeding with Neanderthals at that time. And then life has got even more complicated because now we have some sequence from a species, or a putative species called the Denisovans, based on the sequencing actually of DNA out of just a single tooth and a single bone, but very well preserved in a Siberian cave. A cousin of the Neanderthals, but it now is clear that somewhere between 1 and 6% of Denisovan DNA is found today in various populations in Southeast Asia. Melanesians, Aboriginal Australians, Polynesians, some related groups in the Western Pacific and so forth. It's not found in Africans, it's not found in Eurasians. Okay. So overall then, the picture is beginning to emerge where as recently, it's past even 30, 40,000 years ago when there were other hominins still around, there was still some interbreeding going on, albeit limited interbreeding going on. Could have been rape, who knows, but it was happening. But it was sufficient to leave behind these sort of genetic visiting cards, if you like, from these other populations. So if we keep to a very strict definition of a biological species, that is a population that's reproductively separated from other populations, then modern humans have only unambiguously been separated from other populations for the past 35,000 years. Okay, which is sort of interesting. Some people ask whether evolution is still continuing. Well, that's just to wake people up who are dozing through the rest of that. So, okay, that's enough about evolution. Let's just think a little bit. Oh, no, it isn't. I've just stuck this slide in. I just want to point out that evolution is not a static theory. No scientific theory is a static theory. And itself as a theory, it's evolving all the time. And so at the moment, there's quite a competition between group selectionists and those who think that the individual organism is the unit of selection, or maybe the gene is the unit of selection. This particularly has been addressed by Martin Novak here, by the way, practicing Catholic from Harvard, very well published in this area, and so forth. Cooperation, Martin Novak has suggested, as the third pillar, if you like, together with genetic variation, natural selection. He's suggesting cooperation is so central to the evolutionary process, it should be up there as one of the key components of evolution, and so on. We can talk more about that if you like. Let's do some theology. Very briefly on theology, partly because I started late, and that's my fault, but also I realise this is, bringing coals to Newcastle, but I just want to highlight a few theological points that I think are particularly relevant in this kind of discussion. And so we're going to do a very brief summary. So the picture that emerges from the biblical understanding of God as creator, from church tradition, from commentators and so forth, is that God is the source and ground of all that exists. Everything that exists apart from God has only come into existence because God has brought it into existence. And so then existence refers to anything. Okay, it refers to anything that exists. It could be the laws of nature, it could be mathematical equations, it could be quantum vacuums, Higgs bosons, trees, rabbits, us. Anything that exists, that would be then part of the created order, if it's apart from God, by definition, within this kind of theistic matrix. One of the problems that comes up all the time in this kind of discussion is the difference between human creation, or the way we use create in our daily language, and the understanding, theological understanding of creation. Because when we human beings make things, we work with already existing materials to produce something new. So the human act of creating is clearly never the complete cause of what is produced. But God's creative act is the complete cause of what is produced. And I've got a fairly lengthy quote here. I'm going to read it out. I think it's worth it, from Bill Carroll. God's causality is so different from the causality of creatures that there is no competition between the two. That is, we do not need to limit, as it were, God's causality to make room for the causality of creatures. God causes creatures to be causes. Creation is not essentially some distant event, rather it is the ongoing complete causing of the existence of all that is. At this very moment, were God not causing all that is to exist, there would be nothing at all. Creation concerns, first of all, the origins of the universe, not its temporal beginning, close quote. Pure Aquinas, as I'm sure you'll recognise, and after all, Bill Carroll is the Aquinas Fellow of Oxford University, so no surprises there. But I think it's a very nice summary, actually, and I think once we get our head around that, then so many things fall into place, in terms of the whole discussion, really, between science and faith and so on. Now, since our great creator, God, is not encompassed or constrained in any way by the present created order in which we find ourselves, that means, that's a very important inference, it means that we're not in a place to guess how, or tell God how he should do things. We can't do that. We can only simply find out by doing experiments. As God says to the prophet Isaiah, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways," and so forth. And historians have often pointed to this point in the transcendence of God and the consequent radical contingency of the created order as being at the roots, one of the roots of the empirical method itself. And there's a lot of data about that, which maybe I will just mention one quote on that from Descartes, who writes, "Since there are countless different configurations which God might have instituted here, experience alone, experiments, must tell us, must teach us which configurations he actually selected in preference to the rest. We are thus free to make any assumptions on these matters, with the sole proviso that all the consequences of our assumption must agree with experience." Very clearly stated that the roots of the empirical method have strong theological roots. And then, of course, along with that transcendence of God, in the biblical text, we have this great emphasis on the immanence of God in the created order, that moment by moment upholding and sustaining of the whole created order. God's sustaining is displayed by his faithfulness, I think, is displayed in such a way that we can make science possible. There is gnomic regularity, there is law-like behaviour of the properties of matter, without which science would be impossible, and of course we wouldn't be here. And this is a Trinitarian immanence, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit involved all the way through the process. And I love this Genesis 1:3, where we have the Spirit of God hovering over the waters, ready to bring order out of this tohu vebohu, this formless and empty earth. Hebrews translation has it that far from being the hovering of a bird, the ruach becomes the wind sweeping in on a storm from the Mediterranean. God's ruach swept over the surface of the water. Jürgen Moltmann, the divine spirit, ruach, is the creative power and the presence of God in his creation. The whole creation is a fabric woven by the Spirit. Wonderful phrase. and is therefore a reality to which the Spirit gives form. Go to Calvin in his Institutes, for it is the Spirit who everywhere diffuse, sustains all things, causes them to grow, and quickens them in heaven and on earth, and transfusing into all things his energy, and breathing into them essence, life, and movement. He is indeed plainly divine. If creationists got their head round the immanence of God in the created order, they would no longer be creationists, really. I'm using it in sort of common everyday usage. And I think this is such a key thing to get across, that we don't worship the God who is the distant God, but the one who by his Spirit is immanent in the created order all around us. We get the same in the New Testament, again, through the Logos all things were made, in him all things hold together, very well known verses, which I won't pause on, you know them, in the New Testament. So it's a Christological creation. I would like to just read out this quote. This is Charles Raven. You may not have heard of him. He was a very famous figure here in Cambridge University in the earlier part of the 20th century. He was Master of Christ College, Darwin's College, and he was also Vice Chancellor for quite a while. And he wrote a lot about science and religion, which was very influential on a number of thinkers, especially Anglican thinkers, actually, in the whole science religion domain. And he writes, God as Father was like an artist deciding to create a picture. God the Son was the design on which the work was modelled, and the Holy Spirit was the creative energy in the artist that created the picture. Lovely quote, I like that. So what do we biologists, what are we doing actually when we're doing our research? Well, clearly what we're doing is we're describing as best we can what God does, present tense, in the created order. That's what we're doing. And it doesn't matter in my lab if people are atheists or agnostics or whatever it is, that's what they're doing. When they come in the lab, that's what they're doing. They just maybe don't know it, okay? But we're seeking to understand God's created order, not by invoking the actions of God, the primary cause, to explain those parts of the process which it seems particularly difficult to understand, but rather by saying the authorship of the Creator expressed in that whole biological process all the way through, from beginning to end. Does that entail a deterministic universe with God, pulling the strings and all the puppets? No, I don't think so. That's not a necessary consequence of the creation theology that we've been outlining so far, because it's by that faithful guarantee of the order and gnomic regularity in the properties of matter by his immanence in the created order that by the same token God then bestows upon creation its own functional integrity. Creation does what it does because of its own functional integrity. God bestows upon it those properties that allow it to do its job. And I guess in some ways we find that language, or hint at that language, in Genesis 1, where we read, it says, let the land produce vegetation. We have there the language of gracious permission in the Genesis text. Okay, I started 5 minutes late and I didn't want to take other question time, so I'm going to skip a bit here. But I think what's clear from what I've said so far, I hope you see it's clear, is that these are two complementary narratives. Why did God do it? The theological narrative. How did God do it? The evolutionary story provided by biology. It's not quite that simple, but that's the general picture. And by using the language of complementarity, of course, in no way are we suggesting that these are isolated components. They're all about the same reality. And clearly evolution does present challenges theologically. How could it be that a God of love would bring about his purposes by this process that involves so much randomness, death, pain and suffering? Well, that's a challenge. How do we understand the biblical account of Adam and Eve, original sin, the fall, all of that? How do we understand the biblical account of other things as well? But I think those are the three main questions probably that generally theologically minded people will want to grapple with. I'm going to finish here. I was going to talk a bit more, but I lost my 5 minutes. That's okay. Just to do a little plug from my book up here. This is Creation and Evolution. Do we have to choose? This is the second edition, which is 30,000 words more, I'm afraid, than the first edition. That's a result of people sending lots of letters and emails saying, oh, what about this? What about that? And so in the second edition, you end up having to try and address some of those questions. There's some great books out there. I do try and address all those three questions, actually, in that book. There are some great books out there on suffering, the problem of suffering in terms of the evolutionary process. And I just want to recommend a couple of these. One, Chris Southgate, The Groaning of Creation is an excellent book. Another very good book, particularly on animal evolution and the problem of suffering of animals. Michael Murray, philosopher, Nature Read in Tooth and Claw. I'd recommend that as well. But I will stop there. I'm very, very happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you for your talk. You talked about the functional integrity of the created order. How do we respond to miracles with regard to that, either Christ's miracles in the Gospels or miracles that we might think of as continuing after the time of Christ?
Thank you very much. That's a great question. Yes, so I would say the functional integrity of the created order, if you like, is the backcloth. Imagine the drama on the stage, you know, we're all on the stage. And there's the backcloth. That gives us the starting point for normal life, the starting point for normal everyday life. And then we see the miracles of the Bible, which I guess the main point about the miracles are signs of God's grace, aren't they, in particular circumstances to his people, either to individuals or to a community. And so they have a particular, they're not really about breaking the laws of nature or something like that. That was Hume. So it's amazing how many Christians, by the way, come up with Humean definitions of miracles. I always get worried by that, you know. Why quote from a secular person when we've got John's Gospel to do the job for us anyway? But so clearly, God as creator can do things differently on occasion if he wants to. Now, what I find striking about miracles is there's a whole range which the Bible never distinguishes between. Miracles always got God as the subject of what's going on. But we've got the crossing of the Red Sea, where the text says, the east wind blew all night and the sand blew and so on. So it actually gives us, if you like, an explanation. And one suspects the crossing of the river Jordan was similar to that. It's been blocked a number of times, actually. And, it's a miracle of timing. It's a miracle of answer to prayer. And then we have clearly things like the resurrection. Absolutely no scientific explanation at all. Or turning water into wine, absolutely no scientific explanation. The whole range the Bible sees equally as signs of God's grace, in particular circumstances. It just seems to me where it does involve something different happening from that functional integrity, well, God can do what he wants, in that sense God is sovereign. And sometimes the early modern people talked about God's habits, it's the functional integrity is about God's habits, it's what God normally does. But if God, for his own purposes, wishes to do something slightly different, I have no problem with that. As a scientist, as a biologist, I have no problem with a virgin birth. I mean, come on, God, every time a baby is born, we have a sort of creation of billions and billions of cells. God wants to make one more cell. Is that a problem? I don't know. It's not a problem for me anyway. And the fact we don't know the exact mechanism, I think is neither here nor there. Actually, I don't think it's sort of interesting to look at, but so that's the sort of take I would. In fact, I'll get that. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question. Over in the far corner over there, my left, your right. And if anybody else wants to put a hand up now so that I can follow you through.
Evolution is quite often quoted as a intellectually satisfying way of thinking of how we got here by atheists. Is it fair to say that despite its origin, despite the title of the origin of the species, evolution is really a theory of process and not a theory of origin?
Thank you. That's a very good question. Well, it's often been pointed out that The Origin of Species was a fascinating book, but didn't say anything about origins. Okay, so in some ways, although it did, of course, present the descent and modification. Yeah, I think it'd be perfectly fair to say that evolution is the investigation of a process happening, and it's a process that's been going on since probably 3.8 billion years ago, and you mentioned it being intellectually satisfying for atheists. I mean, I think even more so intellectually satisfying for Christians, if I might say so, because I find it incredibly intellectually satisfying. And by the way, amazing that it's still a theory which is growing in strength, after more than 150 years now. When you look at the history of most scientific theories, they have a pretty short shelf life, actually. They don't go on very long, or they get modified almost out of recognition. Now, of course, the theory that Darwin introduced in 1859 is not the same theory we have today. We have the neo-Darwinian synthesis. We've got genetics now incorporated. within that theory, and that was taking place in the 1920s, 1930s, and so on. But I think I hope it should be an unbelievably satisfying theory, I think, for Christians as much as anybody, atheists or anyone, because and the reason it's satisfying is because it explains so much data. And one example of that, actually, I won't get too carried away on this, but if you think about the sequencing of the human genome, which finally came out in its fuller form in 2003, it could have come out otherwise. It could have, in theory, come out, it shows that our genome has a very different history from the history of Neanderthals or history of other species and so on, chimpanzees and so on. And of course, the way it came out is exactly as the kind of thing you might expect with our evolutionary history taken on board. So genomics has done a huge amount to confirm, the evolutionary process. And as a matter of fact, you can almost build evolutionary trees just through the genomics. So it's a very fine book. Anyone who's really interested in that, it's Cambridge University Press, came out a few years ago. It's written by Graham Finlay, who's a New Zealand friend of ours, cancer researcher, committed Christian, and it's all about genomics and how genomics clearly shows the evolutionary history of humankind, basically. So.
Let's right down in the front here, and then we'll start moving back.
Is it a problem, if thinking practically, if in a church congregation or in another context there are people who with quite strong young Earth creationist beliefs? Just thinking, like, I know people in that situation, and if I was their pastor, should I be seeking to challenge those beliefs if I was persuaded otherwise, and what that might look like? I'm just wondering, because you might want to at least touch on this in a sermon, but it might not be the sort of thing you want to deal with in an aside in a sermon or something. I don't know. Just any views you have on that sort of issue, if it's...
Yes. It's challenging, I think, and obviously it's going to, you know your congregation, you're going to know who's out there. I always have a minimalist kind of goal, I suppose, in the talk, to some churches anyway. That is that people who have different views on this sort of topic can worship happily together in a united way in the same congregation. I happen to go to a church here in Cambridge where that is the case. And we do have a few young Earth creationists in the congregation who are good friends of mine. And it doesn't make any difference at all to our fellowship, our worship, and so on. So that's certainly my minimalist goal, to maintain that. That's obviously incredibly important. Often, depending on the church, I will start out by saying, this is not a gospel issue. Your salvation is not going to depend on this. When you get to the pearly gates, it's not going to be the first question we get asked. I don't think. There are much more important questions, and so on. So I think it's important, especially because I think there are some folk on all kind of, I don't want to put sides, but all aspects of this discussion who get very passionate about these things. And although I might be a bit passionate here with this group, I'm pretty cautious actually. And I do a lot of talking in American contexts, American churches, and you have to be really careful how you approach this topic because it's such a hot topic there. Anyway, but having said all that, I do think we have a responsibility to try and help, especially the young people in the church, a pastoral responsibility, to realize they do not have to reject evolution. And the reason for that is, again and again, we come across people who are atheists, and then you track them a bit, what happened? Oh, well, I was a Christian, and I got back, but actually, my pastor told me that, I couldn't believe in evolution. And then they shut the whole thing out. You see, faith goes out with the bathwater. And, I don't know how many people I have met in that context, actually. Very depressing. So I actually think we do have a pastoral responsibility to carefully and cautiously train and educate our congregations that mainstream science is fine, they don't need to worry about it. And as a matter of fact, you can maintain a very conservative evangelical view of Scripture, which I maintain myself, by the way, just for the record. And you can believe in a historical fall, which I do, by the way. And there are some ways of incorporating the understanding of Adam and Eve, so at least, I believe in original sin, for example, and so on. So I think, if the congregation, especially if they're very conservative folks, sort of know that kind of thing, then that can be a help. You know, that, yeah. So, but it's a big topic. Yeah, it is.
Thank you. We'll move one further back, I think was the next hand, and then one further again.
I suppose linked to that, is the way we sort of combat aggressive Dawkinsism, is it through a better teaching of theology of creation or through a better teaching of evolution? Which do you think is more effective to sort of...
In which context? In the context of the church?
I suppose
or-
generally.
Yes.
What does
yeah.
the scientific communities do? What does the church community need to do to combat that sort of aspect of public discourse?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. Thank you. I mean, I think there are different things, and it depends on whether it's a church or. I think in the church context, amongst Christians, and getting across a solid Thomist probably theology of creation is really important, actually, because I think once Christians really get their head around that, because often what you have in the churches when you talk about creation is a sort of image of God as the heavenly engineer who occasionally is tweaking around with things, you know, perhaps doing an occasional miracle. But apart from that, you know, stuff, nature, again, is autonomous in some way. You get that thinking all the time. And so you get a kind of separation between, as it were, what scientists understand, you know, doing nature and experiments in the lab, and between, you know, the bits that we don't understand. So the bits that scientists sort of do understand, they belong to scientists, and the bits we don't yet understand, scientists, that belongs to God. He's the mysterious. God lives in the mysteries, you see. And I think bringing the whole created order, as it were, under God's aegis and sovereignty is a terribly important thing. So I think starting with Christians, that's where I would start. The doctrine of creation is where we need to start. And obviously hermeneutics of Genesis 1 to 3, that clearly would come up, you know, that is important. I think more generally, in the wider public, I would say it's terribly important for the public to hear leaders in the church talking happily about Darwin, talking happily about evolution. I get a chance sometimes to preach in college chapels here, including Christ, you know, Darwin's old chapel last year. And the topic I've been choosing recently is, why are Christians passionate Darwinians? Okay. Because I think, you know, instead of being timid and instead of being on the back foot, it's much better if we have, it'd be lovely if the Archbishop said something wonderful on Darwin's birthday or something, you know. Lovely, we want to hear the church be enthusiastic about Darwin evolution. That would do more to subvert Dawkins' rhetoric than almost anything I can think of, actually. Maybe the Pope could do that as well. You know, I don't have a hotline to the Pope. Anyone who does.
Thank you very much. I just want to explore the possibility, though, that evolutionary studies are not always totally scientific in the sense. I don't know if you know, Stephen Jay Gould actually said that he felt that evolutionary studies have more to do with humanities, like history, where it is necessarily speculative work. Because you can't, so it's difficult to do genetic experiments, if you like, with populations. A lot of what we read about the geneticists may say about the history of the evolution of species, it is somewhat speculative. I mean, it's a bit like we were talking about multiverses earlier on, which is speculative. There's no scientific test that can be done to determine whether multiverses exist. Isn't it true in evolutionary studies, though, that some of what we read is in that same category, that it's possible, what we're told, you know, this evolved from this, but in the end, that it is someone's opinion?
Okay, I'm probably going to disagree with you there, I think, on the whole. But I think the multiverse case is a very special case, actually, where there's a big debate going on right now. In fact, there's an article in this week's Nature about the whole issue of whether the multiverse idea is philosophy or science and so on. So that's, you know, that is, when it comes to genetics, we're talking about the genomes and the genetic sequences of living species, obviously, or from DNA that we can get from extinct species, a few examples of that. Well, I mean, it's pretty clear. It's nothing like multiverses. I mean, you know, the inferences you can make are pretty precise, actually. Because remember, sequence, I mean, we have 3.2 billion nucleotides, bases. That's the genetic letters in our genome on each chromosome. So multiply that to 6.4. we're talking about huge amounts of data, and you can do great data crunching in big computers, which goes on all around us here in Cambridge and at Sanger Centre down the road. And I would say that that data is pretty good, actually. And so if we're looking at things like last common ancestor, convergence point, and all those sort of things in evolutionary history is pretty good, actually. Now, I'm not saying there are huge gaps, obviously, if you look in the whole evolutionary process of every single organism on Earth and so on. Clearly, there's still lots of work to do on that. I'm not saying that explains everything we want to know, but in terms of where we have really good genetic data, that's nothing like a multiverse. I mean, that's something totally different, actually. So I think I would not agree with your inference there, actually. Yeah.
I'll take one last question, beginning to eat into the tea break. You're around for tea break, aren't you, Dennis?
Yeah, I can
so
sure.
we can,
Yeah.
sure you can buttonhole Dennis then.
Yes.
Well, in there, and then we'll.
You talked a bit about human evolution and migration. Could you talk about how our understanding of human evolution in maybe the last couple of 100,000 years might inform our reading of Genesis 1 to 11 and maybe Genesis 1 to 3 in particular?
Right, sorry for that. I'm just thinking of tea break, so do you want your tea or not? Oh my. Well, honestly, I'm not going to have much time to address that. I mean, I do have a couple of chapters on that. I plug my book, okay, because I did go into that in some detail. Yeah, I mean, clearly, I think what's important, I'll just say what I think is really important in this whole discussion actually, is that we treat the Genesis text and Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15 as, they're theological texts. I see Genesis 1 to 3 as profound theological essays, which we really need to grapple with, to understand the rest of the Bible. So I treat them very highly that way. But I think the first thing we need to do is grapple with them in their context as theological texts and not try and extract from them scientific information that they were never intended to convey to us and about which they have no interest at all in conveying to us. We're always asking Western questions, about the text, which is obviously not written there to tell us, but written there to tell us theological truths. And obviously a huge amount of figurative language in Genesis 1 and 3, and so on. Okay, hermeneutic. So I think, and the same is true, I think, in the science. I've been talking more about the science, I'm a scientist, but I think we need to treat the scientific data, with great integrity as well. And only when we've done that job should we then start, and I think we can have a discussion, and start thinking about how do we apply the kind of theological truths that we've seen in the text, seen in the Bible. How can we apply those to, in some way, with anthropology and so forth? And I think there are ways, interesting ways of doing that. And so what I try and do in this book is to sort of construct different models. I call them models rather grandly. You can call them theological speculations, if you like, which are sort of ways we could go about understanding that. For example, how do we apply that theology? And that's where the debate gets wider. Okay, and that's where I think again stop, because honestly, we don't have time. But
I wish we did. I think we really ought to stop there because we've got tea break until 3:30. But can you join me in thanking Dennis?